Friends, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's important conversation. My name is Mara Bernstein. I'm the Director of Synagogue Programming and Adult Education here at Park Avenue Synagogue, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Dr. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 19th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. In 2013, he served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, he received a 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed that by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass has also served as U.S. coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Dr. Haass is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and 1 book on management. His latest book is The World, A Brief Introduction, published by Penguin Press. Thank you, Dr. Haass, for being here tonight.
Welcome, Bruchim Habaim. It's wonderful to see so many people in the sanctuary, people who I haven't seen for a long, long time. It signals a return into community. It also signals the seriousness of this moment. Dr. Haass, from all of us, we see you here each and every week, and to Susan, to the family, it's wonderful to welcome you here into community. Normally your seat's not quite so good, but it's great to have you here on the Bima, a place that we are proud to be your home. It's such a serious time, but I have to tell you, there's a joke that keeps running through my mind at this time. It's an old joke, but it's painfully current. Told back in the days in the old country when borders were fluid and they shifted this way and that way in Europe. And as a Jew, you lived in a shtetl, and one day it was Poland and the next day it was Russia. And Goldstein was standing there talking to his friend Schwartz, and he turns to Goldstein and says, yesterday it was Poland, today it's Russia, Russia, Poland, Poland, Russia. Goldstein, what country are we in today? And Goldstein emphatically replies, today Poland, definitely Poland, much better Poland. And Schwartz replies, how can you say much better? They're the same and they're both terrible. What makes Poland better? And Goldstein replies, well, I just can't take another Russian winter. All right, I had to give you a Goldstein joke. But it's not, it is a dar, but it's not such a funny time. And the border question goes directly to the subject matter of this evening, because last time we met on Yom Kippur right here, we didn't talk about Ukraine. We didn't talk about this moment. You know, we talked about the environment, we talked about China, we talked about the toxic world in which we live in, but we weren't, I think we thought that this was sort of the one thing we didn't have to talk about. So from Yom Kippur to today, how do we make sense of what's gone on?
Good to be with you, even if the moment is rather dark. And you're right. When we did talk on Yom Kippur, this wasn't on the short list. And I've been thinking about that, lots of reasons. Some had to do with this, just how we think of Europe. Europe was the venue of the 2 great wars of the 20th century. And there was a sense after World War II that Europe had been stabilized with what has now become the European Union, with NATO. And then you had 4 decades of Cold War, and it stayed cold. And you had the Warsaw Pact and NATO arrayed against each other, never came to direct conflict. And it ended on terms that were extraordinarily favorable to us and peacefully. And while there's been some fighting in Europe, say in the Balkans and other places, you didn't have anything on a large scale. So I think part of it was a sense that when we thought about conflict, It was mainly the greater Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria, what have you. And when we worried about the future was all about China. This was the rising great power. And the most popular idea in American foreign policy had become the pivot to Asia. How are we going to, in some ways, shift a lot of our resources from the Middle East? We'd already begun a drawdown from Europe over the years, so we could focus more of our calories and resources on China. And that was the plan. And that was the plan Mr. Biden came into office with. Here he is, in 2-3 hours, he'll give the State of the Union. But the whole focus of his presidency was meant to be on domestic. And to the extent there was a foreign policy focus, it was going to be on Asia and on China. It reminds me, it was Harold Macmillan when he was Prime Minister of England in the late 50s and 60s, if I have my days right. And someone said, well, how do you prepare for all this, being Prime Minister? Like, how do you think it all through? And he just looked at him very strangely and he said, events, dear boy, events. And these are the events that have hit Mr. Biden. You know, when you're president, you can choose just about everything, your running mate, your cabinet. The one thing you can't choose is your inbox. So the question is, this came into his inbox, and that is why I want to, appropriately enough, I want to read something that I don't usually read from something I wrote, but I am here because it's not an original idea. I thought it was an original idea, and then I found out from my tailor, Izzy, that it was not an original idea. Izzy, by the way, is an important scholar. And I wrote a book about wars of necessity and wars of choice. And I thought it was an original idea. And as he said, no, there was this guy called Maimonides. And he was about 8 centuries in front of you, Richard. And it turns out that Maimonides wrote about wars he thought were obligatory and wars he termed optional. And the former wars that were obligatory were waged by the king for narrowly defined religious causes and in self-defense, quote, to deliver Israel from the enemy attacking them. Essentially wars of self-defense. And he distinguished what he called necessary wars, wars of obligation, from discretionary conflicts undertaken by a king against neighbors to extend the borders and to enhance the king's greatness and prestige. Well, guess what? This is Vladimir Putin's war of choice. This is the king's war against his neighbor Ukraine. And it wasn't, and so we didn't talk about it last fall because it didn't have to happen. This is a war he chose to make happen. It wasn't in self-defense. Ukraine had done nothing new to provoke it. Ukraine was not on the cusp of NATO membership. There were no weapons aimed at Russia. My own view is that Vladimir Putin, for whatever set of reasons, I think he saw opportunity. He saw a divided United States. He saw the Afghanistan ignominious withdrawal. He saw a new German government, more dependent than ever on Russian gas. Brits had left Europe. France was focused on an election. He had contempt for Ukraine. If you read his essay from last summer, totally dismissive. So I think he thought this was a fantastic opportunity. Who knows if, and you read his writings and you listen to him, kind of rambling, almost a sense of destiny and legacy. But for all these reasons, the reason we didn't predict this, I would say, is because it wasn't predictable. This is what happens when you're up against some foreign policy that's pretty much determined by the will of one man. And in our system, borrowed it from the French, from Montesquieu, we have the concept of checks and balances. There are none. There are no checks and balances right now within Russian decision-making, which, by the way, ought to frighten people because what Mr. Putin has brought us to this point, and he could bring us to other points going forward. Sorry for such a long-winded answer.
No. And so it doesn't, but it seems that the picture you've painted, Doctor, is that it's the will of one person, not part of a global strategy or some sort of broader Russian foreign policy or
I think he again, I'm not sure. And ambitions can change depending on events and results. So he started this out expecting it would be very easy, a cakewalk. Hasn't turned out that way, but imagine it had. Imagine if his assessment of the United States, Europe, and Poland had been correct, and he had cut through Poland like a knife through butter. Why do we think he would have necessarily stopped there? I think Putin, who sees the great tragedy of the late 20th century, the end of the Soviet Union, this might have been, in his mind, his chance to reconstruct it. And that would have been his opportunity, and he might have continued to roll towards the Baltic states or what have you. And then even beyond Putin, if people had seen him getting away with it, why do we think other tyrants or would-be tyrants would not have taken note and said, hey, that looks like a pretty good idea, I'll try it in my neighborhood. So I actually think the stakes here were enormous, are enormous, but also were enormous. And hopefully one of the, if anything positive can be said to come of this, will be that it will check Putin, as bad as this is. Hopefully it won't go beyond this, we'll see. And that it will get the Chinese and potentially the Iranians and others to think twice before they decide to follow suit in their parts of the world.
All right. So what you're suggesting is that this isn't just relevant, obviously, and horrifically for Ukraine, but the whole world is watching right now, and others wondering how the world is going to respond to this moment right now.
Absolutely. And I was thinking about I had a meeting yesterday with a Chinese official, and we talked about it, and I was thinking about it afterwards, but if you're China, and you have your eye on Taiwan, which for many people, this has been the big foreign policy conversation. Well, you have to ask yourself, wow, look at these sanctions. Do we, as a trading, investing country, much more than Russia, by the way, would we want to face that kind of a response? Answer, no. And unlike Ukraine, the United States, Japan, and others would probably offer direct defense of Taiwan. So again, it seems to me, in that sense, this may have had a salutary effect in that part of it. It also shows the power of sanctions. I don't think sanctions will, there's limits to what we can expect them to accomplish, but pretty extraordinary in terms of what's been assembled here. And again, for more countries that are more economically integrated in the world than is Russia, that sends a pretty powerful deterrent measure, or at least it says it's going to be awfully expensive if you go down a certain path. Let me say one other point, Rabbi, which is that what I'm hoping people see from this is, and it reinforces some other lessons we've had in the last few months and years, is that what happens out there affects here. I know people want to focus on our internal challenges, and obviously we have an array of them. Politically, in our democracy, crime in our cities, inflation, enormous agenda, inequality, long agenda. But our ability to have a chance of successfully contending with them, in part, or no small part, depends upon some stability, some order in the world. If we have to focus our calories, our energies, our time on external things, whether it's COVID or terrorism or wars in parts of the world where we have commitments, where we have economic stakes and the rest, we're not going to be able to focus on our internal challenges. So what I'm hoping is that one of the messages the President imparts tonight, one of the messages I hope Americans take from this, is we don't have the luxury of just focusing internally and almost pressing the pause button for the rest of the world. I think what Putin has done in his own brutal, crude way is basically saying there is no pause button in history.
Well, let's turn domestic for a minute, and we'll keep pivoting. But this does raise a question. It's not lost on me that tonight is a State of the Union. It's not lost on me that the Republican Party seems to be split on this. There's an Ohio candidate for the Senate, J.D. Vance, who said something to the effect of he doesn't really care about what happens in Ukraine one way or another. So there are some people who are saying we are doing too much. There are some people who are saying we're doing too little. So how do we make sense of the American response to this moment? Or what's happening internally in the country?
Well, first of all, you're exactly right. There are those in both parties, by the way. It's not a neat thing. You have Republicans, what I would call more Trump Republicans, as opposed to more traditional conservative Republicans, of which I was one for 40 years, some of whom think we're doing too much or we're siding with the wrong country. We are much more sympathetic to Russia than to Ukraine. And there's Democrats. There was a stunning statement by the the DSA, basically kind of even-handedness in saying that one of the things that had to happen was NATO had to be undone, deconstructed. That was the message here. So you've got people on both sides, I think, who think we're doing too much for different reasons. You've also got people on both sides saying we're doing too little. And there's a lot of debate about why aren't we, people see these long convoys, which look to be kind of sitting ducks, and saying, well, why aren't we just bombing them from the sky? Why aren't we sending aircraft to do it? If it's important, why aren't there American boots on the ground? And the president, I agree with the president here, has been against that, saying it's not simply that Ukraine's not in NATO, and that it wasn't clear, and it still isn't clear, that Americans are prepared for that kind of a commitment. But also, we don't want to turn this into a U.S.-Russia crisis. One of the things we effectively avoided for 4 decades of Cold War was direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, we don't want to have that. And so the real question then is, if we're not going to get in directly, can we get in sufficiently indirectly to create the results we want? And that's what the massive flows of military equipment are meant to do. I would say they've not been sufficiently massive, they've not been there early enough, so we're playing catch up. And what you almost have is this timeline of Russian military advance and the flow of arms, and that's where we are now.
So the flow of arms from the West coming into, and that's happening actively right now.
But the problem is, it takes time to get there, and then it takes time in some cases for them. Arms, it's not like you put them on a shelf, people take them off and plug it in. It takes some time in many cases. So, and we may not have time. The Ukrainians may not have time. And the Russians are bringing in massive, not just numbers of forces, but are using force increasingly indiscriminately. That was the lesson of Syria, that the Russians were willing to use force indiscriminately against civilians, use conventional munitions, but as terror weapons. And conventional weapons can become de facto weapons of mass destruction, and that's what we've seen in Syria. And my fear is, I hope I'm wrong on this, but my fear is we could see it in Ukraine.
So of a series of bad options, right, doing more, doing less, it sounds, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that what this sort of engagement, sanctions, but not actually American troops on the ground, that seems to be...
That's a line. The president won't do that because, again, if you suddenly have American and Russian planes or troops fighting one another, then the danger of escalation is too great. So the real question is, how do we try to indirectly shape the battlefield? And that's all the equipment, intelligence, previous training, and so forth that the Americans and the Europeans are providing to Ukraine. Help also on the cyber front. And then how do you shape, in addition to that, Russian decision-making? In part, as you frustrate them on the ground as best you can. In part, that's what the sanctions are so important. And the idea is to create a context within Russia where the Russian people essentially react and rebel against this war because they see the deaths it's causing to Russians on the ground, and they see the financial cost to their country. They see the cost to their own futures. They're now living in a pariah state. If you're a young Russian, what is left of your future? And so the hope, and maybe ideally, the real question is whether any of the people around who have access to Putin, who also have power in Russia, can be persuaded he's leading the country over a cliff. And we don't know. He's literally, figuratively, you see the 40-foot table. Right. I mean, there's an isolation there, and it's who knows who has access to him. But the real question is, can the people rise up enough where the police won't shoot on them? That's how the Shah lost power. What happened in 78 and 79 in Iran is the revolution succeeded when the police and armed forces would no longer kill their own people and arrest them. Will that day come in Russia? I don't know, but maybe. And then the other thing is, are people around Putin so worried either about the economic price they're paying or, for example, with this threat of nuclear, when he raised the nuclear alert, are some people finally saying in Russia, oh my God, this guy is mad. He is going to destroy this country. We cannot allow that to happen. I am hoping that that thought has occurred to a few people.
But there are serious limitations on the information flow in Russia right now. I mean, what you and I are seeing on the news is not what your average Russian is seeing.
Right, but there's still some getting in. Social media, probably social media in Russia is still more open than social media in China. You don't have the great firewall quite that you have in China. But yes, I mean, Putin, but this war didn't begin with a groundswell of support, and I don't see signs of a groundswell of support in Russia. No, real truth is not getting through in terms of battlefield casualties, but people don't need, as Mr. Dillon once said, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. You don't need media to tell you that the line's a mile long to get to the ATM, or that the ruble has lost half of its value, or that the shelves are empty. Or that you can't fly out of the country and go anywhere except Belarus or maybe China. So that's part of the narrative that's hard for Mr. Putin to shape.
I want to pivot, and eventually we're going to open it up to questions, and I received many questions in anticipation of this evening, to the humanitarian dimension of this. Some 500,000 refugees I saw in an article today, and many of them crossing over to Poland. And I'm just wondering if you could describe both on a human level, but also what the cascade of implications beyond might be to consider.
Let's just say, even before this crisis began, the number of people in the world who are either refugees or internally displaced was 1 out of every 100 people in the world, over 80 million. The only difference between a refugee and an internally displaced person is a refugee's crossed the border. It's a legal, technical thing, but more than 80, 85 million people were already homeless, forced homeless. I'm not talking about economic migrants, people who choose to leave for economic betterment. These are people who are forced to leave. And now we've already got, and this is going to grow. Ukraine's a country of roughly 43, 44 million people. And as the use of weaponry as terror weapons, essentially mass casualty, these are not precision-guided weapons aimed at military targets. These are terror weapons aimed at civilians in cities and apartment buildings. The idea is to sap the morale, to break the psychic and political fabric of Ukraine, to force people into leaving. So I think could well have millions of people, particularly out of the major cities, in the next couple of days. I fear a lot of them will head west in the country as internally displaced people, but then they will cross borders, mainly Poland and Romania would be my, so there's going to be...
Would that destabilize those countries as well?
I don't think so. I think it's a good question. I don't think so. I think you're beginning to see the world gear up for it. There's ways to contribute to it. Psychologically and politically, Europe is far more welcoming. I think they see it's an awkward conversation, but I think they see people coming out of Ukraine as one of us, Europeans and so forth. So they're very comfortable letting them in. There's a tremendous sense of solidarity with them. So at the moment, I don't see the reaction there that we've seen in previous waves of refugees out of Afghanistan or the Middle East. I'm not saying it's fair, I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying the way it is. And so at the moment, I think it all depends on the details and the numbers, but I think it will be manageable, but it's horrific. When you read about the process, it's just a nightmare. And what's happening in many cases also is families, the males in the families are being left behind to fight. So these families are getting split. It's a terrible, frightening, difficult ride. And then all the problems of refugees. But if I haven't depressed you enough already, I apologize, but here comes some more. This could go on for a while. We like to think this is going to be decisive. But this could become something of a frozen conflict. This could grind on for a while inside Ukraine. And we think of refugees as people temporarily living in camps. We are second and third generation refugees. People go to school in refugee camps, or they get resettled in towns. You have all sorts of health care provision. It's taken on an open-ended status, and this could become a very long-term thing until the real question is, when can we go back safely? Well, I can't answer that question, when it will be possible for people to go back safely into Ukraine. Hope, God willing, it'll be soon. That either diplomatically things will prosper, if there's a change of calculation or what we were talking about, domestically induced changes in Russia. But otherwise, this could become a new frozen conflict with all the awful human consequences of that.
This is a very naive question, but I just don't know the answer, so I'm sitting across from you, so I'm going to ask it. In a time of war, and many people have emailed wondering what can we do, where are the relief organizations, is it possible for any sort of third-party relief organization to be engaged right now? I know I've implored the community to get engaged with JDC. There are 200,000 Jews who live in Ukraine, but what about other international efforts?
Enormous. If you go on the Council on Foreign Relations website, you go on PBS's website, NPR's website, New York Times, you've got all the organizations that you would turn to in any crisis. You know, there's doctors.
And they can send people there.
Doctors Without Borders. The groups are the International Rescue Committee, the medical care, and then there's various UN agencies. So the answer is yes, and some of them specialize in different things. But yes, and some are setting up shop, as you mentioned, in neighboring countries, some things inside Western Ukraine. But yes, there's things that can and should be done. Governments are also contributing. I know, that's part of the necessary response. You've got to send arms, but you've got to help refugees. You've got to send economic help because the economy is going to grind to a halt in many areas. So it's a lot of tools right now that we need.
All right, and we'll continue to let the community know, and hopefully as soon as this Friday night, we'll have more discussion on this specifically to the Jewish community in Ukraine, which. You know, because it's a synagogue, I have to ask a question about Israel. Israel seems to have been trying to walk a tightrope here. There was apparently some conversation in the papers between Bennett and Zelensky, and for about 20 minutes, someone suggested a summit meeting in Jerusalem or something like that. Where does this put Israel vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine?
I haven't seen any news today, so if I'm a little bit out of date, I apologize. Up to now, you're right. Israel, you put it generously. Israel's been walking a tightrope. I would say Israel is disappointed. It has not condemned the invasion. Israel is trying to balance its equities here, and obviously, it doesn't like what's happening. But there's been real reluctance in certain quarters to criticize the Russian government, and the reason is that the Russian government is active all over the region, influential in particular in Syria, influential with Iran, and the Israeli government has worked out under the previous Israeli government, and this one, all sorts of, how would I put it, working relationships with Russia in ways in particular containing certain aspects of the Syrian threat and what happens in parts of Western Syria near Israel. And there's been a debate within the Israeli government, within Israeli society, what should take priority? Is it those narrow, what matters to Israel considerations? Or is it these larger considerations? I've been critical, by the way, not simply of Israel, I've been critical of other countries that are also straddling. India, some countries in the Middle East like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and they all have their direct bilateral reasons, if you will. They're narrow reasons. But at the end of the day, Israel's most important relationship is the United States. This is a major defining crisis in international relations. This is a major defining crisis for this president. So I believe that this is not a time for Israel to hedge its bets. And I just find it disappointing. I think it's short-sighted. And I've said so. It's a synagogue. There you have it.
Okay. So I want to ask maybe two more questions, maybe three, and then open it up to everyone here for your questions. There is a possibility, and you actually named it, that Putin's rambling explanation of nation building is totally self-serving and a farce. Mm-hmm. But I did think to myself, right? This philosophically minded question of what is a nation, and what are the rules of engagement, and where borders are, and what are we 40 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and what is, and obviously as a lover of Israel, you can ask this question that has no end, that we sort of say every nation sort of is a construct that goes all the way back to, Pangea, when the continents were all one. So can you give us some language or vocabulary to sort of understand this moment in the context of that conversation?
Let me take a step back, because it's a big question and it's a complicated question. We tend to use words nation and state interchangeably, and also countries. The words nation, state, and countries, if you read newspapers, books, people almost use them as synonyms. And they're actually different things. And particularly nation versus either country or state not in the domestic sense, but a nation tends to be a group of people who feel themselves as part of a certain kind of large group. Countries can be made up of one nation. It can be a homogeneous country, say like Japan. It can be made up of multiple nations. What's so interesting about the United States is we were a nation and are a nation that was made up of, it was based on an idea, not religion, not gender, not race, not anything. We didn't always live up to our principles, I get it. But it was based on the ideas in the Declaration and the Constitution about opportunity. And again, it's been our unfinished work, as Mr. Lincoln said, for the United States to make good on that. And we've made gradual progress, which is the good news. We haven't gotten where we ought to be and need to be, which is the not so good news. But but we are a country or a state made up of this thing, but ethnically and religiously, and every other way, tons of groups. In the Middle East and Africa, you often have the problem where the lines of borders of countries don't correspond to where nations are. Think about the Kurds. The Kurds are divided and they're found in 4 different countries. Mm-hmm. So they are stateless, and the problem with the Middle East is that often you have within countries, within borders, a majority rule where minorities are oppressed, or even more minorities oppress majorities. Iraq was that way for a long way. Bahrain has elements of that. Now, the question of whether Ukraine gets really complicated because it was part of the construct of the Soviet Union. And they're Slavs, and there's certain ties. Even Mr. Putin calls them fraternal, organic. If you read his summer essay, it's filled with how similar they are. Well, this is one strange way. I mean, even Cain and Abel have nothing next to this about dealing with your brother. To kill them wantonly like this, callously. So if he does see them as brothers, it's a very strange way to them out. Indeed, what he's done, though, is whatever the similarities are between the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine, increasingly the politics now are dividing them apart. One of the many ironies of Mr. Putin's aggression is that he's created a much more separate political identity for Ukraine. And I think that there's probably no walking back of that would be I think we've passed whatever the Rubicon is there. But look, you can selectively choose things from Soviet history about Ukraine's status, what happened in the 50s when Khrushchev's treatment of it. You can deal then with what happened after the wall came down in 89. Ukraine then had been a state, if you will, within, or republic, to use the technical phrase, within the old Soviet Union, then became an independent country. That was fine. And I think what was really problematic to Mr. Putin was more than anything the fact that it was somewhat democratic. And that set an example. I mean, think about 2014 when the crowds came in the street. That was, and the Ukrainian president got chased from it. Putin intervened in part because he couldn't let that stand. He also didn't want Ukraine to get closer to the EU. There was no great oppression of Russian ethnics in Crimea or Eastern Ukraine or anything else. That was just a pretext. But I think he's worried about this and because there are certain similarities between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. If the Ukrainian people can have an organic tie to Europe and the EU, if the Ukrainian people can be democratic, that's a pretty scary precedent if you're Vladimir Putin. And I think that explains in no small part why we are where we are. But the other thing is, in international relations, to the extent there's rules, the most basic rule is the idea that borders are not to be changed by force. So if the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia wanted to come together, there's mechanisms for doing that. When the people of Czechoslovakia wanted to separate peacefully, there were mechanisms for doing that. What there's not allowance for in international relations is this kind of aggression.
So, what's the end game? What are the options on the table of ending? Is there an option of this ending well, or is this just? Or I know no one's a prophet here, but are there?
I think there's a number of end games, and some are okay and some aren't. The problem is those that aren't are more likely than those that are okay. Just to put it on the table, I think there's probably 4 end games that come. Well, at least 4. I can actually think of unlimited number, but just about Ukraine as opposed to something going wider. So let's leave the wider scenarios out. The 2 that are bad is one is, I mentioned before, the frozen conflict, that this kind of bogs down. And this just goes on, and there's just not, it's almost like parts of Chechnya and Georgia. There's no Battleship Missouri ceremony. There's no end to it. It's just messy for a long time to come. There's Russian troops and there's resistance groups, and it just goes on. And the country just gets ground down. And it could be certainly maybe the center and east of the country, maybe less so in the west. That's one possibility. Another possibility is the Russians gain control over virtually the entire territory of Ukraine, and then you have a very harsh occupation, and then you have what's called the porcupine strategy, or essentially you have a resistance, an armed resistance, probably supported out of Poland, conceivably another country, conceivably out of Western Ukraine. And it's what we did to the Soviets in Afghanistan going out of Pakistan, we and others would try to do to the Russians, probably out of Poland. And then again, but those 2 scenarios don't look that different at some point. It's just both basically are open-ended, messy, civil, resistance, armed resistance operations. And we have examples of it, places like Afghanistan and all that. It's just awful what happens. The 2 infinitely more desirable outcomes, the most optimistic, the 2 optimistic, one is diplomacy, that at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, Mr. Putin essentially decides that the game isn't worth the candle, that he comes in particular under domestic pressure because of sanctions, or his inner circle says, Vladimir, enough already. And these talks that began in a desultory manner yesterday on the Belarus border begin to show some possibility. We're not there yet. I can think of dozens or features that would go into the talks, but talks never succeed until the various protagonists are both willing and able to compromise. We're not there yet. They both have to decide that compromise within limits is preferable to the fighting. We're not even close to that yet, certainly on the Russian side. The other possibility, as I said, is a domestic change within Russia. That Putin is either loses his free hand or is deposed or whatever, and that a different Russian leadership comes to the fore that is then willing to go into the negotiating path, withdraw forces, agree to a ceasefire, withdraw forces, and come to some set of terms with the government of Ukraine. I can't tell you if there's a timeline on change within Russia that would get you there. The only way we get there through negotiation, otherwise, again, is if the Russians come to the calculation that that's a less undesirable path than continuing the war. I don't think they're close to that yet. I see no signs. I can imagine they could install a puppet government in Ukraine that would agree to very harsh one-sided terms, but that's not going to stop the armed resistance. So I think basically so it almost boils down to two scenarios. One is one that's consensual, however we get there between Russia and Ukraine, and the other is open-ended resistance between Russian occupiers. And I think those are basically the two futures. And the worst scenario is you have a version of that and then a larger war, because of the Russians decide one way. For example, if we are supporting a Ukrainian opposition out of Poland, the Russians at some point move against that, and that's moving against a NATO country. Or I can imagine the uses of some weapons of mass destruction, chemical or other things. I can imagine cyber attacks. The Russians retaliate against sanctions and try to inflict pain on European and American financial institutions, what have you. So this could unfold, shall we say, in lots of ways. And again, so I can imagine the positive ones. I can't give you odds.
Okay, let's open it up for a few questions. We have Mara, and we have the newest member of our team, Julie Schwartz, who we welcome warmly, who have microphones.
Is she a descendant of the Schwartz in your story?
Yeah, she's, yes. If your last name is Goldstein, you get the first question, but otherwise we will move forward. So any questions? I have about 8,000 more, but a question is a short statement with a question mark at the end of it.
Well, the question is, we now have sanctions. Are there any variations in policy from sanctions that may affect those 4 endgame possibilities you've just outlined?
Well, first of all, these sanctions are quite remarkable. I've done a couple of books on sanctions. I've never seen anything this extensive with this degree of international support. The problem is there's very little about the history of sanctions that suggests that even sanctions as remarkable as these can turn things around. They're slow-moving. Countries often find ways of working around them. We don't know, for example, whether China will provide something of a lifeline. We don't know what India will do, what some Middle Eastern countries will do. Sanctions also tended to work when you have powerful, independent constituencies within the country that want them to work. South Africa is the most successful sanctions case, but that's because the bulk of the population, the business community, others wanted them to work. They wanted change. That's not the case yet in Russia. And even if a lot of people want change, they don't have agency. They're denied agency in their own country. So what we're trying to do, if you think about it, is go after a lot of the people who are close to Mr. Putin. When you read about sanctioning the oligarchs and people of real economic power, that ain't a coincidence. What one wants is to basically get the elites of Russia to come to the conclusion that Mr. Putin's too expensive, too dangerous. You want to get people out there. So but this is like a slow fuse, and no one can put a timeline on it. And it's not going to happen fast enough to protect the people of Ukraine. So that's why it's not an alternative to what we're doing to rush military equipment in. I see it as a longer-term complement to the policy. But again, they've gone remarkably. I mean, the fact that the Germans, now the Swiss and others, we're seeing a lot of precedents being set in sanctions. It's a little bit hard in some ways. Russia is not the most easy country to sanction in certain ways. It built up over $600 billion of foreign currency reserves. Its budget is predicated on oil being less than $50 a barrel. It's twice that now. So technically you could have their exports of oil and they'd still get the same amount of revenue. Their debt is really small. So we're trying to make it difficult for them to finance their debt. They don't have a lot of debt to finance. It's not a great trading country. And indeed, some of the things they have also give them some leverage: energy and grain. And certain minerals. So it's not as though economic warfare is just a one-dimensional exercise. So again, I think the sanctions are important in terms of shaping the environment for Russia, in terms of maybe influencing some behaviors. Certainly others like China will take note, but I just don't think they're going to be dispositive as much as I'd like them to be.
Thank you. We have yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you would respond to a Soviet scholar I heard yesterday who pointed out that in 1989 the West promised Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded closer to the Russian border. And she pointed out that, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, how we responded when Khrushchev was going to bring missiles to Cuba. That's my first question.
Okay, before you go to your second one, let me answer that. The conversations that took place after the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 over the next few years, what you just heard didn't happen. The issues about NATO enlargement were put forward to the Russians, and at critical moments, the Russians accepted it, including Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Yeltsin, and others. I don't think they always liked it. I thought in many cases we made a strategic error, as did some other people. But the idea that we had any sort of agreement with Russia that we violated, simply that doesn't hold water. It doesn't mean, again, everything we did was wise, but that didn't happen. Though there were conversations, but zero agreements on them as to that involving Secretary of State Baker. And I also want to say is that even though in 2008 the process of potential membership to Ukraine was opened up, it hadn't advanced significantly and it wasn't on the near-term agenda. And we've told the Russians that. The Russians have heard, nothing's happening anytime soon or the day after anytime soon. So that's just not a real, it's just not a real rationale or justification or explanation of anything of Russian action. Indeed, it's also pretty odd if your goal was to discourage countries from joining NATO and NATO from beefing up. I can't think of a more counterproductive policy from Russia's point of view than the one we've had. So it just doesn't add up. Again, I think the more powerful argument is to do that Mr. Putin saw a real opportunity, saw a legacy, and was worried about the example and the competition, if you will, for hearts and minds that Ukraine set.
And if we have a moment, we'll come back. But there's another question here. Is that sir? No, behind. And then we'll come back, Artie. We'll get you.
Speaking of opportunities and calculus, how might all of this influence China's behavior on Taiwan?
How will it influence China? It's an interesting question. As we speak, the United States has just sent a delegation. It's a private delegation led by the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and several people to meet with the government of Taiwan to reassure them. But I actually think this has helped Taiwan. I think I mentioned it before. One is China's much more economically integrated than Russia. China's the world's second largest economy. Russia's, 12th largest economy, something like that? It's relatively modest, and it's fairly concentrated in a couple of grains, energy, minerals. It's an underdeveloped economy. China's not an underdeveloped economy. China's far more vulnerable to sanctions, far more dependent on investment and trade in both directions than is Russia. So China, watching this, if I were a Chinese official, I would go, wow, this would really, really, really be damaging. And a big part of the legitimacy for the Chinese leadership over recent decades has been derived from fairly significant levels of economic growth, which have already come down significantly, in part because of demographic changes in China, the aging of Chinese society, the results of the really misguided one-child policy. The COVID has slowed things down further. Environmental damage has slowed things down. Bad state policy has slowed things down. China faces all sorts of problems with over too much debt. Anyhow, millions of problems. They don't need a major economic crisis. Plus, if you're Xi Jinping, what is your priority? It's called this fall. What happens this fall? Party Congress meets. He wants his third term. He can't afford to take any risk whatsoever, I believe, over the next year. So there's all that. So I just don't see this happening. Plus, look at the support we've given to Ukraine. And even though we haven't given direct military, no boots on the ground, planes in the air, we would put boots on the ground and planes in the air for Taiwan. And the difference is our allies in Asia would scream for it, and our allies in Europe were not asking for it. didn't want it because they were worried about a East-West war. The Japanese, the Australians, and others very much want it. And we understand if we didn't provide it, that would be the end of the entire alliance system that the United States has constructed in Asia since World War II. So I actually think one of the unexpected salutary parts of this is it has dramatically pushed back against Chinese ambitions on Taiwan, which were heating up a little bit after Afghanistan, I thought. Even though people like me were saying, don't read into Afghanistan and think it's a test case in any way for Taiwan. And this will also probably stimulate Taiwan to spend a lot more on its own defense. It's been underspending. So actually, I think also it's going to stimulate us to spend more on defense. I would watch this space of American defense. We spend a lot, I get it, $750 billion. That's a lot of money. As a percentage of our GDP, it's roughly half the level that we averaged during the Cold War, roughly half. And we now face a future where we've got to obviously worry about an aggressive Russia, a potentially aggressive China, and a rising China, and all the problems in the Middle East. So I actually think we're going to end up having to spend more on defense, and one of the places that's going to have to think about that is China. We're going to be able to put more capacity in that part of the world over the next decade.
Okay, thank you. And then one and then two there. Yeah.
There have been a number of articles written about energy policy, both Germany as well as the United States. I know Ken Griffin wrote an opinion piece talking about several things that U.S. should be doing, such as more fracking and other things, and balance off the environment versus the risk of Russia. I'd be curious as to whether you agree with it, what you think the possibility is of some of the countries around the world changing their view in this area.
It's a good question. Yeah, in the last few years, people have been, for understandable reasons, dealing with climate. Particularly on the left in many countries, there's been a real push against fossil fuels. In Germany, for example, it led to what did it lead to? The cancellation of the nuclear program and the acceleration of purchases from Russia. And as we used to say, how's that working for you? And in this country also, this administration really wanted to tighten up certain things. The problem is, and there was a very good essay in the magazine we published, Foreign Affairs, the last, I think it was one issue ago, is we're going to be living with fossil fuels for decades. And to prematurely limit the production of certain fossil fuels, in particular liquefied natural gas as well as oil, I'm talking about coal. Coal we can substitute for now 100% and should. It's a big mistake. We still need gas, and we need oil. We're going to need it for decades. And so yes, we should do all we can with solar, and we should do all we can with wind, and I wish we would do more with nuclear in this country and in the rest of the world. I think it's a big mistake that we're not. And just as a side of hypocrisy of the previous German government, they got out of the nuclear business, so where were they increasingly getting their electricity from? The French grid. Well, how did France get electricity into its grid? From nuclear power plants. So it wasn't very impressive. One of the, I thought, real stains on the Merkel legacy. So I'm hoping it causes a rethink. In this country, what I'd like to see is a greater balancing between energy security over the next couple of decades, but in a climate change responsible way. I do not think that is a contradiction, but we've got to get it right. And I think what we've done is we've dialed down too much on fossil fuels, particularly gas, to some extent oil, before we could dial up on the alternatives. And we've got to get that more in sync. Because you've seen the news the last 2 days. These new climate change studies are horrific. So and I get slammed when I say this sort of thing. So this does not mean that we make climate change less of a priority, even though it's not much of a priority now, to be perfectly honest. It should be more of a priority than it is. But we've got to rethink what we mean by energy security. At the same time, we try to be aggressive on climate change. And I don't think we got it right. And I'm hoping I'll be curious to see what the president says tonight. I know that there's been a big debate in the administration about this, about how to get this balance. And I'm not sure they're ready to come out with this yet, but it's one of those watch this space issues. I think there'll be more on this as in coming months, because it's going to force a little bit of a rethinking.
Okay, thank you. We'll just do, I think I promised this, and hopefully once the cameras are off, people can have a moment to ask other questions. But yes, and I might reserve the final question.
I just wonder if you could expand a bit on why you think this happened now. You said before you thought Putin saw an opportunity, but he's been aggressive against Georgia, aggressive against Ukraine, multiple times over many years with very little pushback or problem. Why didn't he do this before? What do you think were the particular circumstances that pushed it now?
And the answer is we don't know. But you're right. But part of it is every time he used force previously, he did pretty well with it. I mean, his previous wars of choice have worked out pretty well for him, particularly 2014 with Crimea, not so well in eastern Ukraine. And Syria's worked out well, but he could do it all from the air. And we basically created space for him to do it. Why did he do it now? I think, as I said, I thought real opportunity he saw, given Afghanistan and given January 6th and our political divisions. What I don't know is whether he was particularly worried about developments in Ukraine. Again, there was nothing new on NATO, but talk about the EU. Zelensky, I think, really got under his skin, a more charismatic leader. I think the wild card in this, and I'm just going to say something now that I have no basis for, but too many people have mentioned it to me that I can't dismiss it, is that there's a health issue with Putin. When you look at him, there's something going on, apparently. And his performance in these recent public talks he gave has been bizarre. This is not the same person I've seen for the last 20 years. This is not nearly as disciplined. This is erratic, all over the place. So I can't prove anything I've just said, but I've heard it from enough other people too. Every single person, I mean, if you watch Bob Gates this weekend, Condi Rice, every single person said, this guy is off. Something's going on. And so, and then the essay he wrote, he published this summer. I remember reading it at the time. When he taught, it was a kind of legacy thing, and whether he feels some pressure. So whether it was opportunity pull or something push, I don't know. And we may never know until he does disappear. But so my guess is we don't know the whole story. But I think there's more to it than I guess. Should I say this? I always get in trouble when I have that conversation.
I've had that feeling many times from this pulpit.
What do you do?
I usually say it.
Okay. And you're still Rabbi here.
And I'm still here.
My wife's shaking her head no. So why didn't he do it over this year? I also think he might have gotten more worried about I think he didn't need to do it in recent years, because I also think a lot was going his way. NATO was getting weak, and the United States was distancing itself from NATO, particularly in the Trump years. And why, that old line about don't interfere with your opponent when he's doing things that weaken his prospects. I don't think, why would he need to do this when the United States was threatening to pull out of NATO, pulling troops out of Germany? Things were moving his way. And then suddenly you had an alliance first administration come into power, and he may have said, oh, what I assumed a year ago is no longer true now. I have no basis for knowing that, but I'm just putting it out there.
So it's not lost on me that tonight's the State of the Union. So as people go home or even watch this after this, what should we be looking for? Is it going to be about energy independence? Is it going to be about defense spending? Is it going to be about solidarity with Ukrainian people? Like, what are we looking at tonight?
Well, first of all, States of the Union speeches, I've worked on several when I worked for President Bush the father. They're usually about a month to 6 week process. And this was one of those where it's almost like the old newspaper movies, call rewrite. This one was probably pretty far advanced. And then suddenly this changed things. So the Ukraine-Russia thing has probably gone from almost not being mentioned, almost like our Yom Kippur conversation, to now, I don't know if it gets a third. The Ukrainian, I think, ambassador, she'll be there sitting next to the First Lady. This is going to be a big part of it. And it's going to be an explanation of why we're doing what we're doing and the importance of this. I think that's one big part. And the needle the president has to thread, and I don't think he's going to get into energy security particularly in detail. I don't think he's going to get into more defense spending. I don't think they're ready for that. And the fact that there's, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, there's already 2, if not 3 responses, not by Republicans, by Democrats to his speech. This is something new. I'm used to having the other party respond to a State of the Union. Having your own party respond to the State of the Union is, it's like having, it'd be like having 3 other rabbis give a sermon right after you up here. We couldn't allow that. So I don't think he's going to do things that will necessarily, alienate the left. The progressives, what he's going to, though, have to do is essentially say we're going to do all this in the world. At the same time, we're still going to use his phrase, build back better. Or however he's going to chop it into bits. He's going to have to lay out a domestic agenda, almost as if this hadn't happened, and then lay out a big foreign policy agenda now, even though he still has this domestic agenda. I think that's the trick, and how to try to build something of not a consensus, at least enough people across the political spectrum that would support it. He'll also talk about his Supreme Court nominee. These speeches also tend to be laundry lists. And that's the worst part of these speeches, where you have to check this box, check this box. It'll be a long number, kind of a catalog of things that don't quite knit together, but you have to say them in order to satisfy this or that constituency. But I think the big part, what I'm hoping is he maybe ties together the democracy thing, that we're fighting in part for freedom there, and we've got to fight for freedom here. And I'm hoping there's a little bit of that in the speech. But other than that, I don't know. But I'm also, I just got to speak personally, I'm not used to sitting here having a conversation with you and not be starving. So this
we can drink water right now.
We can drink water. This is slightly unnerving to me. I feel I'm on very unfamiliar ground.
There's certainly not a water bottle on Yom Kippur next to us, but I do hope that next time when you are sitting here without the water bottle, Dr. Haass, that we can look back on this moment, please God, with a little more shalom, a little more peace. And we thank you for giving of your time, your wisdom, and your leadership at this critical and very scary moment.
Thank you, but also, thank you and your colleagues here. This has become